Hello, good morning, everybody. We will just give about a minute or so for people to filter in, get their coffees, and get onto the webinar. So we'll get started in about a minute, 90 seconds, something like that. Hello, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are in the world. My name's Nick Chubb, and I'm really delighted to welcome you to this research launch in partnership with SEA-LNG, where I'm really pleased to be launching our alternative fuels barometer. We've got a packed agenda here this morning. I'll just take you through it very briefly. First things first, as we always do, is I'll take you through some of the highlights of the research. The Maritime Alternative Fuel Barometer will land in your inbox this morning after this webinar has finished. It's 54 pages, it's completely packed with a huge amount of insight. We've taken data from the market, data from the media, and we've interviewed 25 industry experts to get their view on where the industry is going and how we can unpick the future fuels maze. I'm then delighted to be able to say that we'll pull in some of those experts in a panel discussion for about 20-25 minutes. And of course, most important participant this morning is yourself. You'll see on the bottom of your screen, there is a Q&A function. What tends to happen with these webinars is we get no questions or very few questions in the first 40 minutes or so. And then we get far too many questions to be able to answer them effectively in the last 10 minutes or so. So what I'll say to you is, please, if you have a question, if you think of something you'd like to ask, either myself or the esteemed group of panelists that we've got to discuss this topic, then just pop it in the Q&A box and we'll come to it at the end. But don't wait, and certainly don't be shy. Right, well, without further ado, let's jump in. As I say, this report will come out to you in the next hour and a half or so. We're really excited to be launching it. We feel like it's long overdue that we were able to take a really hard look at what is going on with alternative fuels, where is the market going to go, and I hope be able to provide some helpful guidance to ship owners, charterers, and also ports and terminals who are going to be so responsible for developing the infrastructure. But first off, looking at the research, actually, where are we today? Where are we now? This is the order. This is the current fleet as of September 2023. So you can see there, just over 0.5% of vessels by number are running on alternative fuels, and 99.4% are running on conventional fuels. So perhaps it feels like there's not a huge amount of progress made, but actually, if you look at the order book, there is a fair chunk of the market sort of moving on to alternative fuels, 16% by counter vessels. Again, perhaps that feels like not a great deal of progress has been made, but when we actually look at the tonnage of those vessels, it paints a slightly different picture. So today, by tonnage, 6.5% of vessels are fueled by alternative fuels, 93.5% conventional. But critically, for the first time in September last year, the order book actually tipped to be more than 50% alternative fuels. So all alternative fuels is now 51.3% of the order book by tonnage, 48.7% still conventional. So I think that's a major milestone for the industry, that we are absolutely taking this question of alternative fuels seriously, and that we're looking at using alternative fuels for what is going to be larger vessels that burn a lot more fuel. So I think that's quite a lot of progress, actually, which is quite exciting. How does that break down? The majority of the order book that is alternative fuels is LNG, so just over 40%, and then methanol is the next largest, and then there's a spattering of others, battery and LPG making up about 3% across them. So it would appear, based on the order book, that certainly LNG and methanol are the most popular choices, but absolutely not the only choices. And we've, through this barometer, looked at quite a wide range of fuels. So I'll just take you through those. As part of the research process, what we did is we went out and spoke to 25 experts. That included ship owners, it included ports and terminals, it included expert consultants, it included journalists, it included people in politics. And we asked them about the range of alternative fuels that may be available. And you can see on the left-hand side there, the net sentiment. So what we did is we ran a sentiment analysis, taking all of the interview transcripts, and we said where are positive mentions, where are negative mentions, and where are neutral mentions. And we've ended up with this net sentiment by fuel type, LNG coming out top, and ammonia and methanol coming up next, which probably chimed with most of the discussion that is had. We also took about 1,000 market announcements from 2022-23. So a market announcement could be it could be M&A activity, it could be an announcement to invest in a piece of infrastructure, it could be an innovative startup getting funded to develop alternative fuels. And we've actually found that the most popular announcements we're making was actually around electrical and batteries, followed by hydrogen, and then methanol, ammonia, and wind as well. We also looked at the technology supply and demand balance. So looking at those market announcements, how many of them related to demand for a certain fuel type, as in perhaps the contract being awarded to supply bunkers, and how many of them related to the development of the supply of that fuel. So for example, the announcement of infrastructure to provide LNG bunkering. And you can see there, biofuel, electrical and methanol and wind, a huge amount of demand activity and relatively smaller amounts of supply activity, particularly on the biofuel side. LNG coming in, still slightly more demand than supply, and then we move over to those fuels where there's much more work being done on developing infrastructure, developing the supply side capacity, hydrogen, ammonia, and lastly nuclear, and consequently there being perhaps less demand. So we took all of that and plotted future fuel based on the volume of market announcements and that equilibrium of supply and demand. And we've ended up with 4 distinct categories that we've put future fuels into. So that's today's alternatives, which is up in the top right of the screen, capacity constrained fuel, which is in the bottom right, future fuels, which is up in the top left, and then the bottom left is what we're calling moonshot. So just looking at those in line, today's alternatives, currently LNG and biofuel, there's the balance against supply and demand is relatively in line with the volume of activity, makes them viable as alternatives today, but they could be superseded by other fuels in the future. And we also took, going back to those interviews, looking at the volume of mentions across the interviews, the net sentiment as well. Both LNG and biofuels, or LNG in particular, has a high volume and a high net sentiment. Biofuels also has a high net sentiment, but significantly less volume. Significantly less people sort of talking about it as an option. Looking at capacity constraints, these are the fuels where there's a significant amount of volume activity and more demand-related activity than there is supply. And we've categorized methanol and electrical into those categories. Methanol has a high volume of mentions and a medium sentiment. So there's definitely some methanol skeptics out there, and batteries and electric power, again, medium sentiment, but again, a lower volume of mentions. Future fuels, fuels where there's a high volume of activity, more supply side activity than demand, highly likely to be possible in the future, but currently there is more activity focused on developing the supply of the fuel than there is demand for it. And in that category, won't be any surprises there are hydrogen and ammonia. And both of these, particularly hydrogen, have very high net sentiment, and ammonia has a high amount of volume. So you can start to see a picture emerging of what the future fuel mix might look like. And lastly, we've got a moonshot, which is where there's much more supply activity going on, and significantly less demand, and it's all at a relatively low level. And that was really mirrored across the interviews. Generally, the sentiment towards it is in the middle. Certainly, lots of reasons to be sceptical, and a medium amount of volume. It's certainly possible that we could see a nuclear future, but I think there'd have to be a huge amount more investment to make it probable. The report itself goes into detail on all of those fuel options. We just don't have time this morning to do it, as we've got a pretty packed out agenda. So I'm going to skip straight to the recommendations to industry. But if you're interested in any of those fuels as individual fuels, or just the wider picture of where everything's going, where the experts we interviewed believe the market may move, I would absolutely suggest download the report, brew yourself a cup of coffee, and take a couple of hours to go through it. But our core recommendations to industry are these. Number one, what was abundantly clear from all of the interviews is that there isn't a single winner. There isn't an obvious alternative fuel that will take us to net zero without issue. So there is almost certainly going to be a multi-fuel future, and so developing a diverse fuel strategy with an emphasis on transition fuels is pretty critical, and actually maintaining some optionality within your fleet, or some optionality within the infrastructure you're creating. Number two, we are massively underinvesting currently in infrastructure and also safety for alternative fuels. The infrastructure piece is a difficult one because there's not actually a huge amount that ship owners can do, but it's definitely more on the side of ports and the energy industry generally. But absolutely, we need to develop the infrastructure to be able to transport these fuels, and we're not currently doing it based on the data that we've collected over the last 12 months. The other thing that is often seriously overlooked is safety. With fuels like methanol and ammonia in particular, is how are you going to be able to create technical standards and be able to train crews to be able to handle these fuels in a way that is safe. We're a long way off that, and we need to be able to do that in a short space of time to make any of these alternatives viable. And then finally, number three is actually we need to be doing more to embrace technological and operational optimizations. So yes, absolutely, we should be focusing on alternative fuels, but one of the real issues that perhaps we are aware of, but it's almost too big to tackle, is that the demand for alternative fuels outside of maritime will almost certainly outstrip Maritime's buying power, if you like, as an industry. And so every joule of energy that can be saved will need to be saved. And so there's a huge amount we can be doing in the short term, as well as exploring all of these alternative fuel options and looking at alternative fuel options that are available today. It's actually about finding what can create optimization and improve the ton-mile efficiency of the fleet as far as possible, because yes, it has a big impact today. It will have a much bigger impact tomorrow. That was a whistle-stop tour through the research. There's so much in it that I wasn't really able to do it any justice at all, but it was the best I could do in the 15 minutes that I had. So I would recommend keep an eye out on your emails, download the report when it comes. And as I say, there's 50 something pages. It's packed full of research, including a breakdown of all of those fuel types. And I'm biased, obviously, but personally, I think it's a hugely valuable guide. I'm delighted now to be able to move on to a discussion with some experts to be able to unpack all of this a bit further, perhaps debate the findings, and see where we come to. So if I could ask our panelists to please come onto the screen. So that's Steve Esue, the Chief Operating Officer at SEA-LNG, Tom Strang, Senior Vice President at Carnival Corporation, and Paul Taylor, Global Head of Maritime Industries at Societe Generale Investment Bank. Tom, why don't you kick us off? Could you perhaps just give us a bit of an understanding of your first impressions of the research, and also just an introduction to yourself and sort of where you're coming from in this discussion?
Well, thanks very much, Nick. For those who don't know me, my name's Tom Strang. I'm a Senior Vice President in Carnival Corporation and PLC, which is obviously a cruise operator. We operate 9 brands globally. We currently have 9 LNG fueled vessels in operation, and we've done a number of trials around biofuels as well in the last couple of years. So And we're very active in the space of looking at and trying to understand what the future fuel pathways are likely to be going for the next between now and 2050. Like many other operators, many other ship operators, ship owners, we've set ourselves a net zero target by 2050. We're fully aligned with the process that's ongoing at the IMO to understand how we'll get there. And clearly, research like this piece produced by yourselves, Nick, is very important, and having a clear understanding of what those potential pathways might be is clearly absolutely necessary. And I think, you know, when I look at the recommendations that you've reached and the conclusions you've reached, I'd have to say I fully endorse those. You know, having a diverse fuel strategy, not putting all your eggs in one basket. I think you put it somewhere in the report, there is no silver bullet. If there was, we'd all be doing it. And clearly part of the challenge that we see is that we endorse a fuel neutral pathway so that we can pick the most appropriate fuels and find the best solutions in this space. As I've said, we've already committed to a certain proportion of our fleet on LNG, and we clearly see LNG as that fuel in transition with a move towards biofuels and bio LNG in the future and potentially e-LNG moving forwards. But we're also looking at methanol. We've looked at hydrogen, we've looked at ammonia, we've looked at nuclear. I'll be the first to say we're unlikely to be the sector that picks ammonia as a fuel of choice, because there are significant safety concerns still that need to be addressed. And I do feel, and for those who know me, it's one of my favorite topics is infrastructure, is the challenge that we face. We've seen that with lessons that we can learn and transfer from the LNG uptake into these other sectors, and to understand how we can move forwards there. And I would absolutely endorse the view that safety, and particularly if I look at it from an operator's perspective, the number of crew members that we're going to have to train in these new fuels and to understand some of the risks associated and how we mitigate and manage those risks is a massive challenge. But it's one that I think we're ready for. And finally, just very, very quickly, it is definitely true that energy efficiency, making your ships more efficient, is going to be something that we are going to continue to do. As a company, we've been doing it for 20 years. We continue to do it. We expect every new build that we deliver to be 20+% more efficient than the last one. And that is something that's absolutely essential as we move forward. So just a little bit of my thoughts there. A good read, I would recommend it. I don't think there are some things there perhaps that may not be as affected in my sector as in others, but working together with other operators in the various different fora that we are in, we can clearly see that there's going to be a lot of interest in this. So we're looking forward to the panel debate.
Thank you, Tom. That's a great way to kick us off. Steve, why don't I come to you next?
Thanks, Nick. So my name is Steve Easel. I'm Chief Operating Officer of SEA-LNG. And as the name suggests, and as many of you will know, we're a global industry advocacy organization focused on improving the understanding of the environmental and commercial benefits of LNG as a marine fuel. So I'm very happy to read the study. As I say, we commissioned this work from Thetis. And I think it's a complement to some work that we did a number of years ago when we asked DNV to look at the techno-economic aspects of the different alternative fuels being discussed. I think it's fascinating to contrast, and as this report seeks to do, the perceptions that are out there with the actual reality. And I think what my key takeaway from the report, and I do recommend it, it's a great read, not only full of information, but actually very nicely written, is just the range of views. And I would maybe confusion is not a very good word to use, but the range of views as they relate to alternative fuels. But I think we do see that as part of a sort of process of maturation in the industry. And certainly as we're seeing, regulations which are really beginning to bite at the EU level and at the IMO level, then there's really becoming, I think that people's thoughts are now crystallizing more from, the theoretical aspects of the various fuels out there to actually practically what can we do in the short to medium term. So, and I think this study is a very good, if you like, input into that, there's that developing process. So yeah, very, 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 very interesting work, and looking forward to the panel discussion.
Thank you, Steve. And finally, Paul, why don't you give us an introduction to yourself and then your initial thoughts on the research?
So, yeah, hello to everybody. Yes, so my name is Paul Taylor. I'm the Global Head of Maritime Industries at Société Générale, French bank. I'm also Vice Chair of the Poseidon Principles, which, of course, as many of you will know, is one of the first climate alignment initiatives set out, and of course, with shipping leading the way, we're very proud of that. First of all, on the report itself, I'd like to congratulate you. I think it's an absolutely excellent report. Not just the content, which I think clearly shows a multi-fuel pathway, but actually the way it sets it out, because this is a hugely complex subject, which we all find, unless we're all scientists or engineers, we all find very, very difficult, and it sets out very, very clearly. So congratulations on that. In terms of SocGen, where we are in the market, we're a leading ship financier and advisory house within the shipping market. The energy transition is absolutely at the centre of our business model. It has to be, because not only are we one of the founding members of the Poseidon Principles, where we are very transparent in the publication and reporting of our CO2 emissions intensity on our portfolio, but the bank is one of many banks which are signatories of the Net Zero Banking Alliance, the NZBA. And this goes much wider than the Poseidon Principles. This is across the whole banking industry, not just shipping, but across the whole banking industry, and where banks are setting climate targets, commitments to achieving along the pathway to 2050, starting in 2030. So the clients we are banking, the ship owners we finance, we do need to align ourselves with our wider commitments. And this means financing the ship owners that are taking the energy transition seriously. It means financing those ships with the lower emissions. And over time, that's going to drive the liquidity that's available in the market. So this is a huge, huge topic. We've got to look at the ship owners, the ships. We've also got to look at the emerging leaders in technology, the carbon capture providers, onboard carbon capture, the rotor sails providers, the smart data technology providers. This is all key in the financing market. Has to be there to support all these, and not just the ship owners and the fuel suppliers. So this is absolutely key, and I'm looking forward to the debate.
Thank you, Paul. I'd actually like to start with you, if I may, just because you raised it there, that question around finance, and I touched on it in that initial presentation, just the amount of infrastructure that needs to be developed for any one of these fuel pathways, not even considering the whole mission to get to net zero. How is perhaps the finance industry's view changing on this, and how should the industry be thinking about accessing finance to either invest in vessels or invest in short-term infrastructure?
Yeah, and you're absolutely right, Nick. In terms of infrastructure, those fuels that are in the report all require infrastructure. Apart from LNG, of course, where the infrastructure is in place, that's a proven market, and the banks are financing not just the infrastructure itself in the ports, but also the bunkering vessels. So that's where LNG, of course, has a huge head start on the other fuels, and that's the $1 trillion that is allegedly required, or more than that, for ammonia infrastructure to be in place and to be a viable fuel of the future. Clearly needs to be financed by somebody, by many parties, and likewise, methanol is probably easier, but clearly nowhere near as advanced as LNG. So yes, they need to be financed, and I think that the market's there. The liquidity is in the market. There's a lot of providers of liquidity today. You've got the banks. The banks have liquidity. but they've got to use it in the right place. And if they don't, that capital will be taken away from the banks in maritime and put into other sectors which can use it in the right way. So it has to be used correctly, but the liquidity is there. Let's make no doubt about it. Banks have liquidity, but also the more institutional investors, the capital markets, there's huge liquidity there. There's actually not enough projects to feed that liquidity. So let's not talk about a shortage of liquidity in the market. There are regulations in the market which are driving the direction of bank capital, but there's no shortage of liquidity. The question is, who does pay for these? And it's going to be, I'm afraid I've got no, again, a magic answer, no silver bullet, as Tom says. The funding is going to come from a mixture of taxes, it's going to come from sovereigns, it's going to come from the private sector, and ultimately, I'm a bit negative. I think ultimately the consumer will end up paying for it, as they invariably do. But actually, let's not panic. The liquidity is there. It's just a question of channeling in the right direction.
That's really interesting, because I think in a lot of the conversations that I have, there is a perception that liquidity is perhaps hard to access. So it's good to hear that a representative from the finance industry is waving the flag to say that there is liquidity available to invest in this stuff.
Nick, just one thing, if I may say, liquidity is there, and of course, all the investors, including the institutional investors, now are having more climate targets, so they're having to look at which project they should invest in. And of course, there's that very small aspect of risk. And this is where, at the moment, if you look at the emerging leaders, some of the technologies that are coming through, which are going to play a vital role, they're not supported by strong corporate balance sheets. And this is where today I think the financing markets are still falling short in finding a way of providing capital to the startups, to the emerging leaders. It's all very well when there's a large offtake agreement in place for 15, 25 years, as the LNG market found over the last couple of decades. But at the moment, those long-term contracts, those offtake agreements are not in place, which will usually drive the capital. So that is why I think there's a feeling that the financing is maybe not there, but the liquidity is there.
Yeah, that makes perfect sense, and definitely chimes with our experience. Steve, I'd like to bring you in, because Paul raised an interesting point around infrastructure, and that was that LNG is proven, and you've effectively been on this journey with LNG as a fuel, developing the infrastructure, and getting it to a point where it is, well, as we saw from the order book data, it being adopted quite readily. Are there any lessons that we can learn from the rollout of LNG and the rollout of LNG infrastructure that could be applied to other alternative fuels that the industry is exploring?
Yeah, I think there are a number of lessons on the finance side, and I'm sure Paul can speak more eloquently to this. But one of the things that we've noticed is you've essentially got two industries coming together. You've got the energy suppliers who are building the production capacity and the infrastructure to deliver the fuel. And obviously we can look at LNG here, and you've got the buyers, which is the shipping industry, and the buyers are very much used to buying spot on the short term. There's gross generalization, and the energy suppliers are very much used to having long off-take contracts to guarantee their investments. And I think that has been and continues to be an issue in LNG. So, how do you actually mobilize the capital to get the investments made and the infrastructure and supply side? So, we anticipate that that's going to be a very significant issue for many of the other alternative fuels, where they don't really benefit from that, if you like, large-scale bulk infrastructure that LNG does benefit from. So you've got literally, hundreds of liquefaction and regasification terminals spread globally, spread around the world, many of which are actually close to or within existing ports where bunkering operations take place. So the infrastructure issue for LNG is less than it is perhaps for some of the other alternative fuels, but it's still problematic, I think.
Yeah, that makes sense, and I think that's a valid point. Is that even though LNG is the furthest along in the journey, it's by no means able to completely take the place of conventional fossil fuels. So there's absolutely going to have to be those lessons applied to methanol and others.
Yeah.
Tom, we talked about safety earlier, and you brought it up in your opener. So I just had to sort of circle back to some of the technical aspects when we look at LNG, which obviously you've got experience in rolling out, but also fuels like methanol, which you may be exploring, and ammonia, which you sounds like you're ruling out. What do you think are the main safety aspects that should be considered by operators who are sort of looking at all of their options?
Thanks, Nick. What are the main safety issues? We could talk for hours on this particular subject. First things first, I think there's a massive piece of work that's currently ongoing, both at an IMO level, an EU level, and within individual companies that are looking at and reviewing the different safety requirements that there are with these different fuels. They're all low flashpoint fuels. They all, well, the majority of them are low flashpoint fuels that we're talking about here. And they have challenges, they have their own challenges. Obviously with ammonia, the biggest issue is the toxicity piece. And that's something that we certainly see in the cruise sector that it's very unlikely. And it may even be that we're regulated against using ammonia as a fuel. As an engineer, as a naval architect, we'll always find technical solutions. But then when you look at that supply chain and the massive uptake that would have to be if you were to try to replace all that energy, all that current fuel today with ammonia, the likelihood of spills and the likelihood and the risk levels may be too high for many people in some areas. And certainly though, ammonia does have some attraction because it doesn't have carbon in it. And there is a school of thought that it can be scaled and it could be utilized. But again, the infrastructure is going to be a massive challenge. But then you have to train everybody to use it safely, not just on board the vessel, but you need to train the shipyards that build the vessels, the ship repair yards. You need to deal with the supply chain, the infrastructure. You'll have the same kind of challenges with hydrogen, with its explosive nature and the issues you have there around safety and the design part of that. But that's what the IMO and that's what the regulators are working on at the moment, and will come up with solutions. So I'm convinced you'll find technological solutions to each of these challenges, but it's going to be difficult. And the uptake and the requirement to train all these people is just massive. If I look at what we had to go through just to get our LNG fleet ready, and the extra training we had to provide, it's something you have to provide. You have to start thinking of years in advance of that first ship hitting the water. And certainly we know in the shipyards and in the repair yards, they're already having to think about how they manage that process. So it is a big challenge. If you look across those different fuels, obviously the drop-in type biofuels don't require that level of training. So there's they're very attractive to operators and owners. The challenge is, are they available at scale? Are they available? Are they cost effective? Can you find the fuels in every location that you wanted? You might find a fuel, particularly at the moment in, let's say, Northern Europe, but it's not available in the US. It could be available in Asia, but not available in another part of the world. So you've got a lot of those challenges there that you've got to deal with. And when you start doing fuel changeovers and fuel switching and fuel mixing, these introduce some operational risks which need to be managed. But I'm confident that as an industry, as a sector, the maritime sector will be able to manage that process, but it's not going to happen overnight. It's something that will take time. And I think that's a key part of that. Of all the fuels you've looked at there, obviously the one which probably has the biggest concerns in certain places is nuclear. But I think nuclear is a long way off. And clearly, if you listen to the debate that's taking place, we're not talking about the same kind of nuclear reactors that you see on military vessels. You're looking at, like some people would like to say, fit and forget, but I'm not sure you could actually fit and forget a nuclear reactor on a ship. You're talking about a type of system that is very, very different from what we see today. But again, the training requirement is going to be massive on that. let alone whether that will meet the whether society will accept the use of nuclear in lots of different ports and lots of different locations. But really interesting to read that around that, you know, what people's view are on that. And I think, you know, safety is something that has to be thought about first and foremost when you're looking at all of these different things. On top of that, you've got the changes in technology that take place. You know, if you're starting to utilize batteries and fuel cells, if you're looking at DC systems, a lot of the training required is very different to the training we have today for our existing ships, with most of the systems being run on AC for the electric systems. So it is, again, you've got challenges that aren't specifically related to the fuel, but also to the technology pathways. And all of this shouldn't be forgotten. Now, I don't want to sound like, you know, but that's where we are putting that investment in. For those of us that are lucky enough to have our own training establishments like we do, we're already starting to look at what those courses might be. You mentioned methanol. We do have one ship which has a methanol fuel cell we could utilize. We're looking at how we look at the methanol supply chain. We're looking at what the training is required there, because there is some changes and some differences. But that's where LNG, again, has helped us prepare for some of this. You know, we're not saying LNG is the solution to everything by any means. We know there are other pathways, but clearly the lessons we've learned can be transferred through. And I think that's one of the things that we see LNG helping us prepare for these alternative fuels in the future as well.
I think just on that question around training and getting training right, I was at a conference in Manila just before Christmas, and the IMO gave a briefing, and they said that they believe the likely timeline for the next set of STCW amendments is probably going to be around 2040 that they can actually come into force. So if we want to get ahead of this stuff, we're going to have to do it ahead of the IMO and certainly ahead of STCW as a framework. So I think taking that really proactive approach to training is super important. I'm starting to see questions trickle in, which is fantastic. In the next few minutes, we'll switch over to the Q&A. So if you do want to ask a question, just pop it into the Q&A now. We'll come to it in the next few minutes. But before we do, Tom mentioned about drop-in fuels and drop-in biofuels. I thought perhaps you'd be a good person to educate the audience on drop-in fuels and how they can be used. What's your view on where drop-in fuels sort of fit into this whole mix of different options?
Sorry, was that for me, Nick?
Sorry, that was for Steve.
Steve, okay.
Yeah, I mean, I think we've seen a lot of developments on the biofuel side, if you like, a sort of a first movers towards decarbonisation, mainly in response to, I guess, voluntary commitments that customers are feeding through, voluntary decarbonisation customers that customers are feeding through to into their logistics chain. So, I think that I'm clearly not an expert in terms of biofuels, but that has scaled significantly. You just have to look at the volumes reported in ports like Rotterdam and Singapore. Albeit, you know, there are perhaps a certain number of challenges in terms of liquid biofuels, in terms of blending. I think for LNG, and I think one of the interesting things that came out of the report was, I think there's a lot of work for us to do on the LNG side as to educate the industry of the drop-in route to decarbonisation that LNG offers through initially through bio-LNG or biomethane, and in the future through as and when we see greater quantities of renewable electricity being available through synthetic methane or synthetic LNG. I think the beauty of this pathway is those fuels are very pure methane. Essentially, it's the identical methane molecule to the molecule that's primarily composes LNG, and it represents there are no blending issues. So these bio and synthetic versions of LNG can be used very, very simply in the existing vessels, and also utilize the existing delivery infrastructure as well. So I think that's a very for me, a sort of powerful message that comes out of the report, but clearly one that's not necessarily understood by the shipping industry as a whole when we're talking about LNG.
Fantastic. It's time. We've got questions flooding in now, which is wonderful. So we'll just start to tackle them as best we can. I think probably Tom, the first question makes sense to go to you. A shift to lower flashpoint fuels, which actually you've mentioned already, will be an issue for responsible ship repair yards. What are managers' plans in this important space, i.e., arrive empty, gas-free, from alternatives, or some kind of other solution? What are your thoughts and plans there, Tom?
So thanks for that, Nick. And thanks, Matthew, for the question. We have already dry docked a number of our LNG fuel ships, for example, with gas on board. So it is possible to dry dock these ships. It's all about planning. It's all about going through the proper risk management process to understand what those risks are. It will depend very much upon the kind of work that you want to do, the level of outfitting that needs to take place, the level of repair work. If you're working on the tanks, there's no way you're going to go into a dry dock with gas in those tanks. So you'll have to gas free them. But it is something that, you know, there are processes and procedures that are being documented between us and the shipyards, and the regulators clearly are looking into this, and it is something that is it is manageable. We don't have any hydrogen fuel ships at the moment, certainly not in our fleet, but there's very few around the world at the moment, and as such, those processes will also need to be looked at, as it will with ammonia, where the issue is more around toxicity and potential leakages. But again, it comes down to developing those proper procedures, and also, to be quite honest, designing the vessels at the start to be able to go into dry dock and to carry out certain repairs while fuel is still on board, if that's at all possible. So it's something that is being managed today through existing design processes, which are based upon risk and risk management.
Yeah, that makes sense. And I think your point earlier, which was something akin to, we will always find a technical solution. I think chimes there. There's a lot of creative options there for managing this stuff. Another question: supply and demand is something you focused on, but what about the relative cost of these fuels? I'll probably say at this point that one of our panelists, Margaret Doyle, who is a fuel broker, was supposed to be with us, but unfortunately she's caught COVID, so has had to back out. But she would have been the perfect person to answer that question. But perhaps, Steve, would you be able to give your view on the relative costs of the different fuel options?
Yeah, I mean, I with a degree of caution, of course, because there is so much as unknown. But I think as a general point, we're looking at a very different world when we're looking at alternative fuels in terms of costs, and that's probably broadly recognised. So if you're looking at essentially you've got your fossil, you've got your bio-derived fuels, potentially blue fuels, which are CCS enabled. So, for example, blue hydrogen, blue ammonia. As if you like, the next tier in terms of production costs. I'm not talking about prices. It's quite a different thing. So you're looking there at, I don't know, a whole 2 to 4 times more expensive when you're looking at the bio derived fuels at the moment. And these are numbers that sort of published by the Mercer McKinney-Moller Center. So for clarity. And then if you're looking at electrofuels, that's e-ammonia, e-methanol, e-LNG, then you're currently looking at cost differentials of about 5 to 7 times. So it's going to be a cost shock or price shock to the industry, I think. Clearly, you know, as these fuels scale, you can see there will be significant falls in, or likely to be significant falls in production costs. But still, I think even when we're looking out towards 2050, we're still looking at a fuel environment where these green fuels are going to be costing significantly more than traditional marine fuels.
Yeah, that makes perfect sense. And I think, as Paul mentioned earlier, there absolutely will be a cost to all of this, and ultimately it's likely to be picked up by ultimately by consumers. There's a question in here that's actually for me on the research itself, so I'll answer that briefly. So the question is, dear Nick, thanks for the report webinar. Your research is commissioned by SEA-LNG, and your findings show that LNG is the first alternative fuel in the overall order book percentage. I'm willing to believe you, but what kind of evidence are you using? Is it all provided by SEA-LNG? I think that's a really important question. As with all thesis research, we maintain the total editorial independence. I would say there are things in the report that SEA-LNG ultimately just wouldn't agree with necessarily, but in the light of actually doing an objective view of this, we've absolutely been keen to include everything, the entire view from all of the experts that we spoke to. In terms of the data sets that we use, the order book percentage data came from Clarkson's, but the Clarkson's order book data was published in September 2023. We were given access to DNV's alternative fuel insights data, which helped us with where we are today, and also some order book data came from them as well, and also data from TTS IQ, which is our technology research intelligence platform. We've got about 1,000 or so market updates from the last 12 months to give us that supply and demand equilibrium. So there's three data sources, or three secondary data sources, if you like, that we've used to pull that together, and then the primary sources were the 25 experts that we interviewed, which includes the panelists here today. Paul, question for yourself. It's interesting that CO2 removal in its entirety is not in the mix. We're working on a technology that has been incubated over a decade, with the provenance being audited by academics. It'd be good to have your thoughts on this as an option. At the end of the day, carbon removal is the key issue, is what this question is saying. Paul, what's your view on that? Because you mentioned carbon capture right at the beginning of this, and so it's obviously an area you've had exposure to.
Yeah, no, absolutely. So my personal feeling is that CCS/CCUS markets are going to play a massive role in certainly over the next 10 to 20 years, because my feeling is that the likes of ammonia, it's a long-term game. This is not going to come through in the next 5 to 10 years, even though the first ammonia ships have actually been ordered. I see that this whole supply chain is going to take a long time to make it scalable and available. So we've got to find a way of decarbonising in line with the IMO, in line with wider climate targets. And I think the CCUS, so the carbon capture underground storage market, is going to play a huge role. So as a bank, we're heavily involved in this. We have, in fact, we hosted a conference last June, which was very well attended on this particular market. Yes, it's true. It's not new fuels. It's ultimately purely taking away the carbon and storing it. But if you can take away the carbon from the emitters by ship and put it into floating storage, then into the ground, this has got to be a large market, we believe, for the next decade, which will give the industry a little bit of time for these other fuels to come through. And they all will come through. In that time, I think LNG is going to play a massive role, and quite rightly too. But methanol, which will be a bit slower, and then ammonia even slower, will come through over the next 1 to 2 decades. But in the meantime, the CCUS market across the world, we're seeing a lot of initiatives in Europe, particularly in Northern Europe, Northern Lights. We've seen a company called Blue Streak being set up recently in the UK. This market is going to develop, and rightly so, but it's clearly not going to replace what is absolutely needed, which is the new fuels.
Yeah, that makes perfect sense. And Tom, I'd be interested in your view on that, but at the same time, I'm going to ask you another question, because it's along similar lines. None of the alternatives are truly carbon free. All the alternatives introduce safety and financial risk. Do offsets not have a role to play here, i.e. the industry achieves net zero without introducing new risks? Let's not forget that the entire system already runs on the leftovers. What's your view on what Paul was just saying there, and then also this sort of offsetting option as well?
So the carbon capture storage, carbon capture and use, carbon capture underground storage, yes, I think that we do think this will have a role to play. there's some key issues that need to be overcome, which is what will be allowable under the different regulatory regimes that we're seeing. You know, as we look at blue fuels, how are they going to be introduced into the spectrum as we work this through? And there's onboard carbon capture that is already beginning to be trialed in a number of cases. We've looked at it. There's different companies that are out there that have already got trials running, and they're quite successful. The big challenge is at the moment, if you're trying to store liquid carbon dioxide, obviously you need a significant volume. You know, we know that if you have 1 ton of fuel, it produces 3 tons of carbon dioxide. You've got to store that somewhere, and you've got to find pathways to be able to discharge and find ways to get that into the secure storage regime so that it's not lost to atmosphere at some time later. And certainly we're seeing new technology coming on stream, which could actually produce solid carbon, which then will, in some form of graphene, which will then have significant commercial value. So we don't rule it out at all. We certainly see opportunities in this space for carbon capture on board to start taking it to play a role as well. In addition to what Paul was talking about, which is the more industrial scale, which you already see in Europe as being allowed under the ETS and other schemes. What we need to understand is how that can then be verified, validated, allowed within the into the regulatory regimes from both an IMO and an EU perspective as we look at that. Remind me what the second question was. Sorry, I just
Offsetting.
Oh, offsetting, yeah.
Instead of capture.
So we believe there might be a role for offsetting, but everything else will have to happen first. Possibly more of a role for insetting at some stage in the future, and insetting might be allowed within the regulatory regime. But clearly at the moment, if we talk about it purely from a regulatory space, offsetting is not considered as part of the scheme. You can't use offsets in the EU ETS, for example. None of the life cycle analysis schemes that are currently under review in the regulatory fields are looking at offsetting as a means to achieve compliance from a ship operator's perspective on that tank to wake piece of the pathway. But it is true that almost none of these fuels get you to absolute zero. So there is, net zero is achievable, but then there is still some residual carbon. And how are you going to deal with that? The challenge is that offsetting schemes, commercial offsetting schemes, and Paul can probably comment on these as well, have had a pretty bad reputation, and we still see a lot of pressure against them. Insetting, I think that's something that's slightly different, and that's where you're looking at it inside that supply chain. If it's heavily regulated and validated, then potentially yes. But clearly, we don't deal with offsets at the moment. It's not something that, and it's in our public, if you look at our statements, in our sustainability reports, it's something that we would potentially consider once we've done everything else. We've looked at the new fuels, we've looked at the new technology. If there is still some residual value, some residual carbon, then you need to look at how you might offset that if we're to achieve those net zero targets by 2050.
Paul, is there anything you'd like to add to that?
I think offsets will have a role to play for sure, but just from a financial perspective, you look at the bank's own commitments that we're making, the wider climate commitments. None of them involve offsets, and they all are in relation to the new fuels, how we're going to come down to net zero for a 1.5 degree trajectory. None of these involve offsets, and when we do have these discussions with our clients, we understand the financial argument and the angle on why companies are considering offsets, but actually they are going to struggle to attract large-scale capital to support projects which are relying on offsets, because most of the capital providers today, or the responsible ones, they have their own climate commitments, and these unfortunately are not taking into account any offsets.
And while I've got you, Paul, there's a question here. I've heard MDO and HFO is better for the environment than LNG. The sulfur has a cooling effect in the atmosphere and is a fertilizer once it comes down. NOx can be removed with urea catalyzers. When using LNG, up to 10% is not burned, causes harmful methane emissions that is much worse than the 25% lower CO2 emissions. Is LNG then a viable alternative? Well, what's your view on that? And then Steve, I imagine you'll have a view too.
Is that a question for me or for Tom?
Go for it. Yeah.
Well, again, from a financial perspective, LNG, we see LNG as a fuel which we should certainly be supporting for now. It's a transitional fuel. I've heard it before, a fuel in transition. We understand that. What LNG has to clearly do to make itself viable long term is become available in a synthetic or bio form. Because when looking at it on a well-to-weight basis, given the current emissions factors that are being used, whether they're right or wrong, and based on the information given on methane slip, which again may not be being updated, that data, as quick as it should be, but that is not necessarily giving as good a results on a well-to-weight basis for LNG as other fuels. So I think LNG has, for now, yes, absolutely, we should be supporting because we believe it's a fuel in transition and has a huge role to play in the energy transition. You see the amount of order book that is LNG, it's over 40%. And we have to remember that people tend to sometimes give a more positive emphasis on methanol, for example. But methanol is worse than LNG unless it's green methanol. If it's grey, it's no particular good. So in answer to your question, the 25% decrease, yes, that's material, but long term, LNG has to answer the upstream emissions and the methane slip. And I think it has the ability to do so because the methane slip on the new two-stroke engines is definitely less than on the four-stroke. And we need the data that's being entered into these models to be updated to give LNG a fair run.
And it feels like a good opportunity for Steve to come in then on just how the LNG sector is addressing methane slip and what your view generally is on that question.
Yeah, I mean, methane slip is a recognised issue in the industry, has been actually addressing it over the years. I think you have to start also with a little bit of history. So when LNG as a marine fuel was introduced, the engines were optimized. These were low pressure engines to deal with issues of local pollution such as SOx and NOx. At that time, there was no focus on greenhouse gas emissions. Increasingly, as there has been a focus on greenhouse gas emissions, that started with CO2 clearly as the major pollutant, but also then a focus on increasing focus on methane because of its greater global warming potential. But as I say, the industry is aware of this, and we shouldn't forget that actual methane emissions represents a waste of useful energy. So, there's always been a clear commercial incentive to improve methane slip. And if we look at if you look at the engine technologies over a period of time, for those engines when methane slip is an issue, levels of methane slip have been reduced fourfold over about a 15-20 year period. And I think one of the things, and that there is quite a lot of information of various quality out there, and I think Paul alluded to the fact that quite often commentators pick up on studies which refer to engine technologies that are 10 to 15 years old, that don't represent what is actually being ordered. And then if we look in the broader picture of the order book, the majority of the engines being ordered now are the actual high pressure dual fuel engines, which effectively have no methane slip. So the engine technologies are there today, which essentially address methane slip. For those engines, and these tend to be the low pressure engines where methane slip is more of an issue, the OEMs are very much focused on addressing that, both in terms of new engine designs, and we're seeing that with Wärtsilä's recent announcement on the tests they did on the Bothnia ferry about 6 months ago, and also an abatement issues. that are being developed. And there are a number of initiatives such as MAMI, which is actually looking to measure actual emissions on board ships and develop technologies to address those emissions where they exist. So I think we have every confidence that in the next 5 years or so, methane slip will not be an issue.
Unfortunately, we've still got so many questions to get through, but we're rapidly running out of time. So if you've answered with a name attached to it, we'll try and track you down after the call and answer it in a written format. But final word from each of you, just a sentence or so. What advice would you give to operators who are grappling, or terminals, whoever it may be, who are sort of grappling with this question of alternative fuels? Tom, why don't you go first?
I think you have to educate yourselves. You know, it's clear that there's a lot of information out there. This kind of report that you've provided helps people understand that. As we said, there is no silver bullet, and depending upon your operation, you're going to have to look and try and find the best available fuel for the space that you're operating in. But educate, you know, and that's all I can say at the moment is the best solution. There's no one answer.
Thank you, Tom. Steve?
A very similar point to Tom. I would say that you know, LNG has the experience of the introduction of LNG. There's a lot the other, if you like, alternative fuels can learn from that, and I think you know, the industry is very prepared to share those learnings. So let's find a way of collaborating more.
Fantastic. And final word goes to Paul.
Well, there's a lot of ignorance. I think the report really helps clarify some of the uncertainty on it, but don't be too judgmental. I think all fuel have a pathway. They have all can be used. From a financing angle, banks are increasingly going to support those companies who have a commitment themselves, who have a strategy for the energy transition, not just the energy transition, but for a net zero energy transition, preferably somewhere near 1.5 if it isn't 1.5. And the capital will be allocated to those companies who can demonstrate that, and who have or who will be investing in fuels, whether it's LNG, whether it's ammonia, methanol, etc. We're fairly agnostic. I think a lot of banks tend to be agnostic at this stage because it's a corporate game. But let's keep an open mind. But we have to all embrace the energy transition.
Thank you. I fully agree with that. I think my closing thoughts are that there is a lot of confusion in the market, and we've seen that through all the interviews we conducted, but we are absolutely heading towards a multi-fuel future, and so it's critical to understand all of those options. The only other things I would say is we're desperately lacking in infrastructure for all of this stuff, and that we have to start to build it out sooner rather than later, because it's going to take quite a while to build. And finally, the policy needs to keep up with technology, and I think we're seeing that the technology is moving very quickly, but things like training standards aren't, which Tom spoke to so eloquently. Thank you so much to our panelists. Thank you to Steve. Thank you to Tom. Thank you to Paul. Thank you to SEA-LNG for making the research possible and helping us pull all of this together. Thank you to everyone who contributed to the research, all of the experts, the MV and Clarkson for checking data with us. And thank you to you in the audience for such a fascinating discussion and so many questions, more than we can answer. It's been a fascinating morning. I hope we were able to take something away from it. Go and download the report. You'll get an email about it very soon, and let us know what you think. We really hope it's a valuable guide for you. Have a wonderful day wherever you are in the world, and thank you very much.